Feeling invisible as you get older is something many people struggle with. It's that unsettling feeling where you start to believe that no one really sees you anymore. You walk into a room and conversations continue without pause. You speak up and your words seem to fall flat as if they carried no weight. I've been there myself. For a long time, I felt like I was slowly fading into the background of life. People who once paid attention seemed too busy with their own concerns. My voice no longer seemed to matter, and even my own sense of purpose started to blur. I know how painful that can be. It makes you feel forgotten, like you're no longer important. But I can tell you this, that feeling isn't permanent and you don't have to accept it. The first thing you need to know is that feeling invisible doesn't mean you're actually invisible. The problem is that people tend to stop showing up for life in the same way they used to. Over time, it becomes easier to step back and let the world keep moving without you. I remember when I first started feeling like I didn't matter. I used to sit quietly in family gatherings and assume no one really wanted to hear what I had to say. I figured the younger folks had their own ideas, so I stayed quiet. What I didn't realize at the time was that by holding back, I was making myself invisible. I was disappearing because I had stopped making my presence known. The truth is, if you start acting like you're invisible, people will treat you that way. One of the most powerful ways to avoid feeling invisible is to stay connected. Don't wait for people to come to you. Reach out, make the phone call, send the message, show up to the event, even if you're worried you won't fit in. I remember one evening when I didn't feel like going to a friend's birthday party. I told myself I was too tired, but the truth was I didn't think anyone would care if I showed up or not. In the end, I forced myself to go. To my surprise, people were happy to see me. They asked about my life and genuinely cared about what I had to say. That's when I realized that I had been isolating myself without even noticing. People didn't forget about me. I had just stopped giving them the chance to remember. Another powerful way to feel seen again is to embrace what makes you unique. Over the years, you've built wisdom and experiences that younger generations haven't. Don't be afraid to share those stories. The mistake I made was thinking no one cared about my experiences, but I couldn't have been more wrong. I started sharing stories with my grandchildren about lessons I'd learned and mistakes I'd made. To my surprise, they hung on to every word. They asked questions and wanted to know more. That's when I realized that my stories weren't just memories. They were valuable lessons that had the power to help others. You have that too. Don't underestimate the value of your experiences. Share them with pride. Taking care of your appearance also plays a bigger role than you might realize. It's easy to fall into the mindset of thinking it doesn't matter how you look anymore. But when you stop caring about your appearance, it's easier to believe that you don't matter. When I started paying attention to how I dressed again, putting on clothes that made me feel good, something changed. People started to notice. Compliments started coming again. It wasn't because I looked younger. It was because I carried myself differently. When you feel good about how you present yourself, you naturally stand taller and carry yourself with more confidence. People respond to that energy. Another important thing is to keep learning and stay curious. Curiosity keeps you engaged with life. I remember feeling like technology was passing me by. I didn't understand half the things my grandchildren talked about. Instead of giving up, I decided to learn. I asked my grandson to teach me how to use social media. At first, I felt foolish, but soon I realized that being able to connect online gave me new ways to stay involved in conversations. Suddenly, I wasn't just an observer. I was part of their world again. Staying curious keeps you relevant. It gives you new things to talk about and reminds people that you're still growing. Giving back is another powerful way to break free from that feeling of invisibility. When you focus on helping others, people start to notice you again. Whether it's volunteering, mentoring, or simply being there for a friend in need, giving your time and energy makes you feel valuable. I once started helping at a local community center just to stay busy. What I didn't expect was how quickly I became part of something bigger. People knew my name. They looked forward to seeing me, and suddenly, I felt like I belonged again. One of the hardest lessons I've learned is that you can't control how other people see you, but you can control how you see yourself. If you believe you're unimportant, it's easy to convince yourself that no one cares. But when you start treating yourself with respect and stepping back into life with confidence, everything changes. People can sense that energy. They start to see you as someone who still matters because you believe it yourself. I know how lonely it can feel when you start to believe you're fading into the background. But I promise you this, you are not invisible. The world hasn't forgotten you. Sometimes you just need to remind people you're still here. So speak up, show up, keep learning, stay curious, share your stories, and embrace the things that make you special. The moment you decide to stop fading away is the moment the world starts seeing you again. You still matter, and you always will. Now, let's clear some common questions. How can volunteering or contributing to the community help someone feel relevant and connected again? I remember a time when I felt like I didn't matter anymore. Days seemed to blur together, and it felt like I was just moving through life without purpose. I would wake up, go about my routine, and go to bed feeling empty. The people I once spent time with seemed busier than ever, and my phone hardly rang anymore. I started to believe that maybe my best years were behind me. That's when I discovered something that changed everything: volunteering. At first, I didn't think much of it. A friend suggested I help out at a local community center, and honestly, I wasn't sure I had anything to offer. I thought, what could I possibly contribute that would make a difference? But I went anyway because I figured it couldn't hurt to try. When I walked through those doors, I expected to feel out of place. Instead, I found myself surrounded by people who genuinely wanted my help. They didn't care about my age or my past achievements. They just needed someone who was willing to show up. That's when I realized that being needed is one of the most powerful feelings in the world. On my first day, I was asked to help set up chairs for an event. It seemed like such a small thing, but by the time everything was in place, people were smiling and thanking me. That simple thank you hit me harder than I expected. It had been a long time since I felt appreciated like that. As the event started, I found myself talking to people I had never met before. Some of them were younger, some older, but it didn't matter. I was part of something again. That night, I went home feeling lighter. For the first time in a long while, I felt like I belonged somewhere. The more I volunteered, the more I realized how much I had to offer. There were teenagers who needed guidance. Some of them came from tough backgrounds and just needed someone to listen. I didn't have to give speeches or lecture them. All I had to do was sit with them, ask how their day was going, and actually listen. I remember one boy who barely spoke to anyone. Week after week, I would ask him questions, and he would only give me short answers. But I kept showing up. One day, he sat down beside me and started talking about his struggles at school. He told me he felt like no one believed in him. I looked him in the eye and said, "I believe in you." That moment sticks with me to this day because I realized that sometimes the simplest words can change everything. Volunteering didn't just help the people I was trying to support. It helped me too. For years, I had believed that my experiences didn't matter anymore. But sharing my stories with younger people showed me that my life wasn't just a collection of memories. It was a book filled with lessons that others could learn from. I told stories about my mistakes, my regrets, and the times I pushed through difficult moments. Each time I opened up, I could see faces light up with understanding. They weren't just hearing my stories. They were connecting with me. One of the biggest surprises was how much volunteering helped me build new relationships. I met people who shared my values and people who challenged me to see things from a different perspective. There was a woman who had lost her husband a few years earlier and found comfort in helping at the same community center. We became close friends because we understood what it felt like to feel disconnected from the world. Our conversations weren't always deep or serious. Sometimes we just laughed over coffee, but those moments reminded me that life still had room for joy. Giving my time also gave me a sense of purpose that I didn't know I was missing. There's something about knowing that your actions are making someone else's life better that fills you with energy. Even on days when I felt tired or unmotivated, I knew that showing up mattered. People were counting on me, and that made me feel like I had a place in the world again. I also discovered that volunteering brought back a sense of confidence I hadn't felt in years. When you're older, it's easy to feel like you've lost your place in the world. But when I stood in front of a group of teenagers sharing advice, or when I helped organize a food drive, I felt like I was capable again. I wasn't just someone who had lived a full life. I was someone who still had more to give. That realization changed everything. Perhaps the most unexpected gift that volunteering gave me was a sense of belonging. The friendships I built, the conversations I had, and the smiles I saw reminded me that I was still part of something bigger than myself. I wasn't invisible anymore. People knew my name. They asked for my opinion. They looked forward to seeing me. And that feeling, that sense of being truly seen, was worth more than I could have imagined. If you're feeling lost or forgotten, I urge you to give volunteering a chance. It doesn't have to be something grand or complicated. Sometimes just showing up and offering a helping hand is enough to remind you that you still matter. Whether it's comforting someone who's struggling, helping at a local shelter, or simply being a kind presence in someone's life, your efforts will make a difference. And in doing so, you may just find that the person you're helping the most is yourself. What are the emotional risks of isolating oneself? And how can someone break free from that pattern? I know what it feels like to pull away from the world. There was a time when I thought being alone was the safest choice. I told myself that avoiding people would protect me from pain, disappointment, and frustration. It started gradually. I make excuses to skip social gatherings. I convinced myself that I was too tired or that I simply didn't fit in anymore. Over time, those quiet moments alone turned into long days where I barely spoke to anyone. I thought I was protecting myself, but what I didn't realize was that I was creating a deeper wound, one that wasn't easy to heal. When you isolate yourself, you may feel a sense of control at first. You get to avoid awkward conversations or moments where you feel out of place. You convince yourself that solitude is easier than facing rejection or discomfort. But what you may not notice right away is how loneliness slowly settles in. It sneaks up on you like a shadow stretching across the floor. At first, you may enjoy the silence. But before you know it, that silence becomes deafening. You begin to lose touch with the world outside, and worse, you start to lose touch with yourself. I remember sitting alone in my living room one evening, staring at the wall for what felt like hours. I had no one to call, no one to visit, and no one who would check in on me. It wasn't because people didn't care. It was because I'd built a wall so high that no one knew how to reach me anymore. The emptiness I felt wasn't just about being alone. It was the painful feeling that I no longer mattered to anyone. That's one of the greatest risks of isolation. It convinces you that you're forgotten. The longer you stay isolated, the harder it becomes to reach out. You start believing that people have moved on without you. Even when someone tries to connect, you may push them away because you don't know how to respond. I remember once ignoring a friend's call simply because I didn't know what to say. I was embarrassed by how disconnected I had become. Over time, those missed opportunities add up, and before you know it, you're stuck in a cycle that feels impossible to break. Isolation doesn't just hurt emotionally. It can drain your energy, weaken your motivation, and cloud your thoughts. When you spend too much time alone, your mind becomes your loudest voice. Negative thoughts grow louder and stronger. You begin to doubt your worth and question whether anyone even wants you around. I remember telling myself, no one would notice if I disappeared. Looking back, I know that wasn't true. But isolation can convince you of things that aren't real, and those thoughts can pull you into a dark place if you're not careful. Breaking free from isolation isn't easy, but it's possible. The first step, and the hardest one, is reaching out. I remember the day I decided to pick up the phone and call an old friend. My hand hovered over the receiver for what felt like forever. I worried that too much time had passed or that they wouldn't want to hear from me. But when I finally dialed the number, my friend answered with warmth in their voice. They weren't angry that I had pulled away. They were just happy I reached out. That one conversation reminded me that I wasn't as forgotten as I believed. Taking small steps made a big difference. I started by saying yes to simple invitations, coffee with a neighbor, a short walk with an old friend, or a visit to the local library. Each time I stepped outside my comfort zone, I realized the world hadn't changed as much as I thought. People were still kind. They still cared. I just needed to give them the chance to show it. One of the most powerful things I did was find a place where I felt useful. Volunteering at a community center gave me a reason to get out of the house and connect with others. Helping people reminded me that I had something to offer, even if it was just a warm smile or a few encouraging words. Being part of something bigger than myself helped me rebuild my confidence, and slowly I started to feel like I belonged again. I also learned that breaking free from isolation doesn't mean you have to be surrounded by people all the time. Sometimes it's about finding those one or two connections that bring comfort and joy. I had a neighbor who would stop by once a week just to chat. Those conversations didn't last long, but they made a world of difference. Knowing that someone cared enough to check in reminded me that I wasn't alone. The hardest part is convincing yourself that you deserve to be part of the world again. When you've spent so much time feeling invisible, it's easy to believe that no one wants you around. But I promise you this, there's someone out there who would be thrilled to hear your voice, someone who would be grateful to know you're thinking of them. The world is still full of people who want to connect. Sometimes, they're just waiting for you to take the first step. If you've been isolating yourself, I know how heavy that loneliness can feel. But I also know that you don't have to carry it alone. Start small. Call someone you trust. Say yes to one invitation. Step outside for a short walk and smile at a stranger. Each little step may seem insignificant, but together they will lead you back to a life that feels full and meaningful. The world hasn't forgotten you. There's still a place for you, and the moment you decide to step back into it, you'll find that there are people who have been waiting to welcome you all along. How can someone handle relationships where they feel ignored or undervalued by family or friends? I know what it feels like to sit quietly in a room full of people and wonder if anyone even notices you. There was a time when I felt like my presence barely mattered to the people I care about most. I would speak, yet no one seemed to hear me. I tried to connect, but my efforts were met with silence or indifference. It's a painful feeling, that sense of being overlooked by those you hold closest to your heart. When family or friends seem to ignore you or fail to value your presence, it can leave you questioning your worth. I've felt that ache before, and I know how easy it is to believe that you simply don't matter. For a long time, I wrestled with those feelings. I would sit quietly during family gatherings, pretending it didn't bother me when conversations flowed around me, as if I weren't there. I convinced myself that I was being too sensitive or that I was better off staying in the background. But deep down, I was hurt. I felt forgotten, like my thoughts, my feelings, and even my existence had become invisible. The worst part was how those feelings slowly started to change me. I became quieter, more withdrawn, and even bitter at times. I started to believe that no one cared, so I stopped trying. What I didn't realize then was that the more I pulled away, the easier it became for others to forget me. One day, after yet another family dinner where I felt like a shadow in the corner, I decided I couldn't go on like that any longer. I realized that waiting for others to notice me was only deepening my pain. I knew I had to do something different, even if it felt uncomfortable. The first thing I did was take a hard look at myself. Not to blame myself, but to understand how I had contributed to the distance. I realized that while I was feeling hurt, I had also stopped putting myself out there. I stopped sharing my thoughts and feelings. I had convinced myself that no one wanted to hear them, but the truth was I hadn't given people a chance. I decided to start small. Instead of waiting for someone to ask how I was doing, I made the first move. I reached out to a cousin I hadn't spoken to in a while. I asked how they were and showed genuine interest in their life. It wasn't easy at first. Part of me feared rejection, that awful feeling of being ignored all over again. But to my surprise, my cousin welcomed the conversation. That small step reminded me that relationships are a two-way street. Sometimes, people aren't ignoring you because they don't care. They simply assume you're fine because you haven't spoken up. I also learned that being seen and valued isn't always about talking louder or demanding attention. It's about showing up in meaningful ways. I started to offer my help during family events. Whether it was setting the table, washing dishes, or simply sitting beside someone who seemed quiet, I made an effort to be present. Little by little, those small acts started to change the way people saw me. They began to appreciate my presence because I was actively adding something to the moments we shared. Another important lesson I learned was that sometimes the people who ignore you are fighting their own battles. I once had a close friend who had grown distant. I assumed he no longer cared, and for a while, I resented him. But when I finally reached out, I discovered that he had been dealing with struggles I knew nothing about. He wasn't ignoring me because I didn't matter. He was simply overwhelmed. That experience taught me that people's silence isn't always personal. Sometimes, they're too caught up in their own pain to notice yours. Still, there were moments when I had to face a hard truth. Some people simply don't value you the way you wish they would. That's a painful reality, but it's one you can't ignore. I realized that no matter how much effort I put in, there were certain family members and friends who would never meet me halfway. For a while, I kept trying to win their attention and approval, believing that if I just said the right thing or did the right thing, they would finally see my worth. But the more I tried, the more drained I became. Eventually, I realized that I couldn't force people to value me, but I could choose to focus on the people who did. I started to invest more time and energy into the relationships that felt warm and genuine. Instead of chasing after those who overlooked me, I leaned into friendships where I felt seen and appreciated. Those connections weren't always with the people I expected. Sometimes, they came from unexpected places: a neighbor who always stopped to chat, a distant relative who remembered my birthday, or even a stranger who offered a kind word when I needed it most. Those moments reminded me that my value wasn't tied to winning the approval of people who didn't recognize it. There were others who saw me clearly, and they were the ones worth my time and heart. I also learned to speak up for myself when necessary. If someone's behavior hurt me, I found the courage to express how I felt, not in anger, but with honesty and calmness. There were moments when those conversations opened the door to healing, and other times when they confirmed that the relationship had run its course. Either way, I found peace in knowing that I had spoken my truth instead of burying my feelings in silence. If you're feeling ignored or undervalued by family or friends, I want you to know that your worth doesn't disappear just because others fail to see it. You are not invisible. Sometimes, people's blindness has nothing to do with you and everything to do with their own struggles or distractions. But no matter what, you deserve to feel valued. Start by reaching out, even if it feels uncomfortable. Show up in meaningful ways, even if no one notices at first. Seek out the people who see you clearly, and let go of those who consistently overlook your presence. Most importantly, never forget that your value isn't determined by someone else's ability to recognize it. You matter, not because of what you do or say, but simply because you are here. And that in itself is enough.